Welcome back to the Deep Dive, powered by Neon Corey Media. We're here for the stories they said were too real to tell. And tonight, wow, we are staring right into the heart of the ultimate American paradox. And trust me, you're going to want to buckle up for this one.
It's this wild cycle, isn't it? The miracle versus the menace, all in the same little chemical compound. Just think about it for a second. The exact same substances that guys like Sigmund Freud and Victorian doctors hailed as these, medical triumphs.
Right.
Or the ones we are now, like, rushing to legalize for therapy today. They're the very same things that fueled the entire war on drugs. We're talking mass incarceration, political hysteria for decades.
Not just about chemicals, it's about stimulants. We're going deep on cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA.
Yeah.
This is about the 100-year story of these drugs. And I think more importantly, how America's view of them. It just violently shifted, based almost entirely on who was seen using them.
And that's our mission today. As we dig through all this medical history, old laws, neuroscience, even the environmental fallout, we're trying to unpack why the drugs we use get so tangled up with who we are. I mean, our race, our class, our politics, and all the trauma that we're, constantly trying to bury. You really have to follow the policy, not just the pharmacology, if you want to find the truth here.
Okay, let's get into it. We have to start at the beginning, right? Section 1. Cocaine's golden age. Because when you look at the old sources, the picture they paint is one of, total uncritical love for this drug. The sources describe its adoption with, and I love this phrase, sacerdotal enthusiasm.
Sacerdotal enthusiasm. It's perfect. Like, it was a religious artifact or something, not a chemical. It was isolated somewhere between 1855 and 1860, and almost immediately it becomes the darling of the medical world. And you can kind of see why, medicine back then was, it was often brutal and painful. They were desperate for effective tools.
And they thought they'd found the ultimate tool, the Swiss Army knife of medicine. They were touting it for absolutely everything. The list is just, it's kind of absurd when you read it now. Toothaches, digestive problems, general nervousness, hysteria.
And we have to stop on neurasthenia for a second. That was like the Victorian catch-all for everything, right? It covered anything from excessive mental exertion, the stress of modern industrial life, to just being tired and feeling down. Cocaine was basically prescribed as the instant cure for modernity itself. It was the original Red Bull for the overworked intellectual.
And the biggest irony of all, they tried to use it to cure opium and alcohol addiction. Think about that. They're prescribing one incredibly addictive substance to treat dependency on two other incredibly addictive substances. It just shows you how little they understood about how the brain actually works. They saw it as a tonic, not a narcotic.
And the guy leading that charge, maybe to the detriment of his legacy, was Sigmund Freud. Between 1884 and 1887, he wrote 4 major articles just championing its medical use. His descriptions, when you read them now, they're just breathtakingly naive. He praised it as an absolutely harmless, marvelous treasure, a stimulant that could boost your energy and fix any kind of debility.
Absolutely harmless, that one line. It should be carved into the wall of every pharmacy on Earth as a warning against hype cycles. It just shows the danger of medical confidence getting way, way ahead of the actual long-term research. It is fascinating, though, that even Freud, after getting a ton of heat from his colleagues, he did eventually back off his recommendations for morphinism and alcoholism. The failures were becoming obvious even back then, but that general enthusiasm just kept going.
But before all that criticism really took hold, cocaine gave medicine a genuine, undeniable revolution. That was in 1884, thanks to a guy named Karl Koller. You have to imagine what eye surgery was like before this. I mean, it was excruciating. Your options were either full anesthesia, which was super risky, or just enduring unbelievable pain.
And Koller comes along and shows that cocaine is the first effective local anesthetic for eye surgery. This was massive. It meant you could do these painless, really complex procedures while the patient was totally conscious. It gave surgeons this incredible control without the risks of putting someone completely under.
And that's the critical context, right? The chemical was immediately seen as the symbol of progress. The sources say it immediately wrought a complete revolution. That high status, the idea that cocaine was, scientific and modern and authoritative, that just transferred seamlessly into mass culture. It wasn't a street drug. It was the ultimate high-class tonic.
Which is exactly why it was everywhere. Before 1914, cocaine was just completely unregulated. You could just walk into a drugstore, a saloon, a grocery store, or just order it through the mail. It came in cordials, crystals, tablets. It was fully legally a part of daily American life.
And the most popular way to take it was the stuff called Vin Mariani, a coca wine. And this wasn't some, back alley product. Doctors prescribed it all the time. It was mostly consumed by professional men lawyers, businessmen, politicians, the Victorian elite. It was seen as sophisticated, something you needed to get an edge in the modern world.
And this brings us to the Coke connection, which is always a fun piece of trivia. So in 1886, Atlanta passes Prohibition. A guy named John Pemberton, who made his own popular Coca wine, suddenly needs a non-alcoholic version, so he creates Coca-Cola. He swaps the alcohol for coca leaf extract, that's the coca in the name, and then adds cola nut for the caffeine kick. It was a stimulant drink for the masses, marketed to literally everyone.
So you have this substance. It's celebrated by doctors, it's endorsed by the highest class of society, and it's freely available in your favorite soft drink. It's completely sanitized.
And here's where the entire story just violently pivots.
Yeah.
This is the moment the drug's identity gets turned into a weapon.
Yeah.
For decades, the typical user was a respectable, upper or middle class, white professional guy. But starting in the late 19th century, that image is just systematically destroyed by this targeted media and medical campaign.
Exactly. All of a sudden, newspapers and medical journals start running these stories alleging that, oh, huge numbers of black men and poor whites are using cocaine now. And just like that, the medical marvel becomes the source of this unbelievable social terror.
The language they used in these reports, it was explicitly designed to create fear and push for a punitive response. We're talking about deeply racialized descriptions that painted black men on cocaine as frenzied, manic, homicidal, lascivious, excitable, criminal, and immoral, end quote. And the key fear they always came back to was the alleged rape of white women. That's how they cemented cocaine as this tool of racial violence and threat.
And that connection, that's the engine that drove the policy. The drug itself didn't change. It didn't suddenly get more dangerous. The people who were perceived to be using it became less sympathetic, and you can see it in the speed of the legislation. By 1900, only 8 states restricted cocaine. By 1915, every single state had restricted it. That is a blistering pace.
And the comparison tells the whole story. By that same year, 1915, only 36 states had restricted opiates, even though opiate addiction was, way more widespread and medically recognized. Cocaine got its reputation as the most dangerous drug, purely because it was so aggressively and directly linked to black men. It was the first time in American history that we basically wrote racial fear directly into our drug laws.
And that codified fear, it didn't just go away. It became the blueprint for the entire next century of drug policy. It established this principle that the user's demographic, not the drug's pharmacology, is what determines the threat level to society.
And that terrifying foundation leads us right into Section 2, the architecture of prohibition. How we went from a society that was just swimming in narcotics to one where being a user instantly made you a criminal.
It's a huge shift because in the 19th century, before the Harrison Act, there was no effective regulation at all. Opiates, opium derivatives, everything was just widely available. Pharmacists would deliver pure drugs right to your door.
And the patent medicine industry was a total Wild West. Before they had to list ingredients in 1906, these companies would just slip massive amounts of narcotics, morphine, opium into their products.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd market them directly to women, or for kids' coughs, or for insomnia, for anything, really.
And that context is so important for understanding who the early users were. When we talk about the addict of the 19th century, we're mostly talking about upper and middle class white women. The majority of regular users were addicted to medicinal opiates like laudanum or morphine. They were looking for relief from chronic illness or stress or just the intense constraints of Victorian life.
Yeah, the surveys from that time totally back that up. Something like 2/3 of all medicinal opiate addicts were female. The opium smokers, Chinese laborers, some white criminals, they were a known minority, but they were mostly just ignored or looked down on. The main body of opiate use was seen as a medical problem, an unfortunate side effect of being sick.
And because these women were seen as respectable, their addiction just didn't cause the same alarm as, say, men drinking heavily. This is the clearest historical proof you can find that moral panic is always about class and race first, and the drug itself is a distant second. The chemical was the same, but the social response was completely different.
But the sources show that within a single generation, about 25 years, the attitudes dramatically changed. By the 1930s, even as the country was debating repealing alcohol prohibition, there was this solid consensus on just suppressing narcotic addiction completely.
And the reason for that change was a demographic shift, driven by new policies. The old medicinal addicts, the respectable women, they slowly aged out and died off. At the same time, doctors got way more cautious after the 1906 ingredient laws and the threat of legal trouble, so they stopped creating new medicinal addicts.
And what you're left with is this residue of generally younger, less sympathetic users. These were the new addicts who didn't start their habit in a doctor's office. They started in brothels or saloons or on the street.
And the policy immediately shifted to target them. They were instantly framed not as patients with an illness, but as psychopathic characters or criminals who were bad before they ever touched a drug. This set the stage for this just devastating criminalization feedback loop that the system itself designed and then sustained.
Let's break that loop down because it's
There.
so critical to understanding everything that came next. The way the sources from that time describe it is just chillingly clinical. So a user, usually from a marginalized background, gets arrested for something minor, petty theft maybe. They go to jail, they lose their self-respect.
And then when they get out, they're qualified by the gang for exploits in the underworld. They have a criminal record now, so legitimate jobs are gone, and they're desperate to fund a habit that they can't get legally anymore.
And what's the easiest way to make that money? Selling drugs. So they inevitably become a drug peddler and distributor, which just further reinforces that link between crime and addiction in the public's mind. It's a perfect self-fulfilling prophecy. The act of prohibition literally created the criminal class that it claimed it was fighting against.
And this whole systemic shift gets formalized with the Harrison Act of 1914. Now, technically it wasn't prohibition, but it so severely limited the medical supply of narcotics that it basically forced the vast majority of addicts straight into the black market.
And that black market was immediately full of adulterated heroin, which was often way more dangerous than the pure morphine or laudanum people had been getting from doctors. The second the government took over, all the quality control just vanished.
The enforcement arm for this new reality was the Bureau of Narcotics, which was later run by Harry Anslinger starting in the 1930s. Anslinger became the absolute archetype of the tough-on-crime cop. Bald, imposing. He was famously described as a sort of beefy Mussolini. He was intimidating, but he was also politically very smart. He knew exactly how to use public fear to get more power and more funding for his bureau.
He's the one who really cemented this legacy of strict prohibition. He turned the Bureau into this fearsome federal power.
But it's interesting, the sources note that the Bureau never actually succeeded in cutting off all medical supplies.
That's right. There was always this small but significant gray market of pure drugs that came from certain doctors. They'd write the occasional prescriptions, sometimes out of pity, sometimes just because they were annoyed by the endless stream of desperate people, and yes, sometimes out of greed. But there was always this threat hanging over those doctors' heads. The idea that a federal agent could show up, audit your records, and pull your license, it just made relying on medical sources way too risky. So the main legacy of the Harrison Act wasn't curing addiction. It was the definitive, state-sanctioned criminalization of the user.
And the results were just horrific. Critics at the time, like Alfred Lindesmith, argued in 1965 that this system made American addicts more impoverished, degraded, and demoralized than anywhere else in the developed world. They estimated the system was fueling up to half of all big city crime because you had all these desperate people hustling to support habits that were made incredibly expensive by the very laws meant to stop them.
Another sociologist, Marie Nieswander, also writing in 65, she summed up that entire era with a phrase that just, it still hits so hard today. She called it an artificial tragedy with real victims. The system literally created the victims that it then turned around and punished.
And that concept, the artificial tragedy, it leads us directly into Section 3, the crack epidemic. This is where that racial disparity that was engineered back in the progressive era just explodes, amplified by global politics and economic desperation.
Okay, so it starts in the early 1980s with a massive supply shock.
Yeah.
Geopolitics shift, and all of a sudden there's this huge glut of cocaine powder coming from Colombia, mostly through the Bahamas. This flood of supply causes street prices for powder cocaine to just crash. They drop by as much as 80% in major U.S. cities.
And if you're a drug dealer, your whole business model just went up in smoke, your profit margins are gone. So they needed a new product, something that was cheaper to make, easy to sell in small amounts, and would get people hooked really, really fast.
And they came up with crack. They converted the powder into this solid, smokable form, usually just with baking soda and water. It was simple. And you could sell it in these tiny, super profitable quantities. That made it affordable for people in low-income neighborhoods who could never afford to buy, a big, expensive bag of powder cocaine.
And the reports of crack started pouring really early. We're taking Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. They were seeing it as early as 1981. This was a crisis building in the inner city for 5 years before Washington even noticed.
And just like we saw in Section 1, a crisis in a marginalized community is never enough to create that kind of national hysterical response. The political catalyst came in 1986 with the deaths of a few prominent people, most famously the college basketball star Len Bias, who died right after the NBA draft. That is what shocked the suburbs and Washington into action.
The media frenzy that followed was just immediate and overwhelming. Lawmakers themselves later admitted that drug stories were the rage. Congress moved so fast that members later said they knew they were rushing to judgment on the bill. They weren't being guided by data or research. They were being guided by the 24-hour news cycle.
And that panic led directly to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which created one of the most racially destructive policies in modern American history, the infamous 100-to-1 disparity for crack versus powder cocaine sentences.
Let's just make sure we all absorb those numbers because they are staggering. The act set a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for having just 5 grams of crack cocaine. To get that same 5-year sentence for powder cocaine, you needed 500 grams, 100 times more. For a 10-year mandatory minimum, it was 50 grams of crack versus 5,000 grams of powder.
So just to be clear, you could be trafficking 49 grams of powder, a huge amount, and face no mandatory minimum. But possessing 5 grams of crack, which is about the weight of 2 pennies, got you locked up for half a decade. This was never about catching kingpins. This was purely about these quantity thresholds that they made up by dividing the powder number by 100.
And the result, whether it was conscious or unconscious, was completely foreseeable. The policy had a seriously disproportionate impact on Black defendants. The sources are brutally clear on this. Congress knew that the association between Black Americans and crack was playing a huge role in how they structured this incredibly punitive law.
The statistics are the scar that's left. African-American adults are 5.9 times more likely to be incarcerated than white adults, even though white Americans use illegal drugs at rates that are generally the same or even higher, and the people getting locked up under these laws. It was historically small-time users, not the major traffickers they claimed they were after.
It's a perfect modern example of Niswander's artificial tragedy, a policy that just hammers one group while leaving the identical but more expensive chemical form favored by another group relatively untouched.
We did finally see a federal policy change, but just barely. In 2010, President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced that disparity from 100-to-1 down to 18-to-1. It was a step, I guess, but it's hardly a solution.
Right. 18-to-1 is still ridiculously disproportionate, and the state laws are often even worse. There are still 13 states with their own extreme ratios. If you look at Missouri, for example, they still have a 75-to-1 disparity. 6 grams of crack gets you the same 10-year minimum as 450 grams of powder. The injustice of the original law is just baked into the state systems now.
And here's the final, structural insult. The failure of the legal system to even see the problem. Our sources argue that U.S. equal protection law often tells courts to just ignore the severity of this differential treatment when they're reviewing crack sentences.
It's a kind of enforced legal blindness. The courts are basically told to look past the unconscious racism and the disproportionate impact because the law, on its surface, is written neutrally. It's powder versus rock, not black versus white. And this effectively blinds the courts to the very features of the law that should be raising the most serious equal protection alarms. The law protects itself from ever having to confront its own racial bias.
That is the deep, lasting scar of the crack era. And it's a legacy of the Harrison Act and Anslinger's whole approach. It shows that even when policy looks like it's reforming, the fundamental architecture of criminalization is still deeply, deeply flawed.
So if the cocaine story is about race and policy, Section 4, which is all about methamphetamine, is about the chronic, often invisible damage to people, to the environment, that this kind of policy repeatedly fails to address.
Yeah, the meth crisis often gets lost in the shadow of the opioid crisis, but the numbers are screaming for attention. Meth-related death rates went up in all 43 reporting states between 2015 and 2019, and in 3/4 of those states, the rate actually doubled. This is not a problem that's going away.
And the polysubstance use is what's making it so much deadlier. In 2021, a third of all drug overdose deaths involved meth. That's over 34,000 people. And here's the key. Fentanyl was present in more than half of those deaths. You have this combination of powerful stimulants and ultra-potent opioids, and it's just an exponentially fatal mix.
The sheer cost to society is it's stunning. Back in 2005, the economic cost of meth use in the U.S. was estimated at $23.4 billion, and the upper estimate was almost $50 billion. We're talking about numbers on the scale of a small country's GDP.
And what's really interesting is where those costs come from. It's not just the crime and the criminal justice system, though. Those are huge. Almost 2/3 of the total cost comes from the intangible burden of addiction and premature death. That really speaks to this catastrophic loss of human potential that we struggle to even put a price on.
We have to force a paradigm shift in how we even talk about this. The sources are clear. Methamphetamine use disorder, or MUD, needs to be managed as a chronic relapsing disorder, just like we treat type 2 diabetes or severe hypertension.
We have to stop treating it like a moral failing. The relapse rates for MUD are right in line with other chronic medical conditions, around 40 to 60%. But for MUD, the long-term outlook is really tough. The relapse vulnerability is extremely high, something like an 88% relapse rate within 3 years. And some studies show an average of 7 relapses per recovery attempt. This needs long-term chronic care, not a few months in jail or a 30-day program.
And you can literally see the damage in the brain. Chronic meth use alters brain activity, starting in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, and then it spreads to the dorsal striatum.
And the VMPFC is a huge deal. It's crucial for emotional regulation, for memory, for making decisions. When you damage that area, you impair judgment, you increase impulsivity, you basically lose the ability to weigh future consequences. That directly explains the impaired decision-making and reduced gray matter volume that we see in long-term users.
Which then feeds directly into the psychological fallout. We're talking about severe ongoing psychosis or paranoid schizophrenia that can last for months or even years after someone stops using.
Sure.
Plus persistent anxiety and major mood disorders.
It's interesting to bring the MDMA research in here too. The sources show that MDMA use also really reduces the binding of dopamine transporters in the striatum, which is important for movement and memory. The good news there is that with prolonged abstinence, they mentioned a 14-month period, there was some recovery, but the initial damage is undeniable.
Now, let's shift the focus from the user's brain to the community, because this is where the damage becomes external, chronic, and just tragically focused on the most vulnerable people in this whole story, the children.
The data on child endangerment from meth labs is just horrific. One study of Child Protective Services cases found neglect in 93% of them. 93%. A history of domestic violence was present in over half. And these aren't just neglect cases. 43% involve felony charges for child endangerment.
And the risk of chemical exposure is immediate and it's persistent. The process of making meth uses these highly toxic and volatile chemicals, acetone, ammonia, lye. They just contaminate everything, surfaces, furniture, the walls of the building. And that creates this huge risk of fire, explosion, and chronic respiratory or skin problems for anyone living there.
And where are the kids while this is happening? They're right there. In 92% of the lab seizures, children were found within 1 foot of the manufacturing equipment or the precursor chemicals. They were in the bedroom or the living room, the heart of the home.
There was one case mentioned in the sources where they found MA sediment methamphetamine residue, actually inside baby bottles. That one image just, it says everything. You have these kids 5 and under who are already so vulnerable because they're on the floor all the time. They're touching everything. Their hands are always in their mouths. They're being passively poisoned.
And the health effects from living in these contaminated properties are just insidious. We see skin and eye irritation, a persistent cough or asthma, constant headaches, sleep problems. Behaviorally, it shows up as aggression, anxiety, and depression.
And the science backs up how lasting this exposure is. They've detected methamphetamine in the hair of children who lived in properties with what were considered low contamination levels. And those low levels were still up to 10 times the official Australian guideline. The contamination literally sticks to your body long after the lab is gone.
Which then leads to the incredibly complex and painful reality of trying to clean these places up. You can't just wipe down the counters. It's this whole process. You need a preliminary assessment, rigorous safety plans, pre- and post-remediation sampling, usually with these specialized wipes to make sure every single surface is clean.
And then you have to dispose of all the hazardous waste. We're talking about clothing, carpets, any appliances with insulation, anything that could have absorbed those chemicals. If it doesn't meet the clearance standards, it has to be treated as hazardous waste. It's unbelievably expensive and often just financially destroys whoever owns the property.
And even after all that money and effort, there's a lasting stigma effect. The discovery of a meth lab causes the value of nearby homes to drop by about 6.5%. Decontamination brings the value back up by about 5%, but it's an incomplete recovery. The stigma just sticks to the location. It's this chronic, invisible damage that never fully goes away.
So the environmental toxicity of meth production, this localized crisis that affects whole neighborhoods, is this massive public health failure that we still largely treat as just an enforcement problem. The pattern just keeps repeating, criminalization over containment, and it always leads to permanent damage.
We've spent so much time on the failures of the past century, so let's pivot now to Section 5. MDMA's clinical counter-revolution. This is the moment where we have to ask, is society finally ready to learn its lesson? Or are we just setting up the next artificial tragedy?
This is the new hope, right? The potential return to that medical marvel status we saw with Freud's hype for cocaine. So MDMA was first synthesized by Merck way back in 1912. And not as an appetite suppressant like the pop history says, but as a precursor for a hemostatic agent, something to stop bleeding. It was basically just put on a shelf for decades.
It was rediscovered much, much later by Alexander Shulgin. He resynthesized it in 1965 and then finally tried it himself in 1976. And that's when its psychoactive potential really became clear.
By 1977, this small but really dedicated group of psychotherapists, including people like Leo Zeff, they started quietly using it as a tool in psychotherapy. They saw its ability to create these immediate pro-social effects, increased empathy, social bonding, and a big reduction in defensiveness.
And that was the therapeutic promise. It helps people talk about really difficult, painful things with less of that cognitive and emotional resistance. It even improves the experience of receiving criticism. It creates this temporary state of psychological openness.
It was being hailed as this transformative tool that could just melt away interpersonal defensiveness and lead to this rapid, profound growth, especially for couples who were struggling to communicate.
But history just repeated itself, and with alarming speed. Because of this radical increase in recreational use and also this growing evidence that a related compound, MDA, was definitely neurotoxic, the DEA stepped in. In 1988, they made MDMA a Schedule I substance, putting it right next to heroin and LSD, and that just slammed the brakes on all clinical research for decades.
And now, here we are. We're fully in the new clinic era. The research is roaring back, and it's all fueled by this ancient logic from Paracelsus. It is the dose that makes the poison. The argument is that when MDMA is used as a controlled medication in a supervised medical setting, it can be incredibly helpful, especially in clinical trials for really complex disorders like PTSD.
But here, this is the critical pivot where we have to apply the lessons from the last 100 years. The complexity of human relationships, especially when they involve trauma, means we can't just ignore the ethical and safety concerns that are already popping up again, especially around MDMA-assisted couples therapy.
This is where we need to slow down and really look at the details. The sources raise a huge red flag about how these new trials are often completely ignoring domestic abuse, and specifically coercive control. This is not a theoretical problem.
Right. We know from existing data that domestic abuse is way more common in couples who are seeking therapy in the first place. And it's also highly prevalent in people with PTSD, which is the main target for this therapy. So introducing a drug that specifically lowers psychological defenses without having incredibly robust safety measures in place, it's just really, really dangerous.
Yet the first clinical trial for MDMA couples therapy, which came out in 2020, it did screen for severe physical aggression. And that's good. But it completely failed to screen for coercive control. And that's the non-physical, insidious pattern of dominance, isolation, and emotional abuse that is often even more damaging than physical violence.
Coercive control is the hidden engine of abuse. It doesn't leave bruises, but it completely crushes a person's autonomy. And the problem is actually getting worse. We're seeing trials right now that are recruiting veterans with PTSD, and they've actually relaxed the screening requirements. They're accepting couples who score over the established threshold for intimate partner violence, and they're often not adding any extra safety measures to protect the non-offending partner.
That is a massive ethical blind spot, a huge safety issue. If the whole point of the drug is to increase vulnerability and intimacy, you are potentially handing a perpetrator of coercive control a brand new, highly effective tool to manipulate and deepen their control over a partner who is, at that moment, chemically disarmed.
Modern domestic abuse programs are emphatic about this. They require individual support sessions and robust safety consultations with the non-offending partner. They track subtle changes in behavior. They establish escape plans.
So if MDMA couples therapy doesn't fully incorporate that research, if it doesn't use screening for coercive control as a bare minimum safety standard and provide individual separate support structures, then we are absolutely risking the creation of another artificial tragedy, but this time in a supposedly controlled clinical environment.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale for this new era of psychedelic medicine. We're bringing back a substance because it can increase empathy and lower defenses, but we're failing to address how power dynamics and pre-existing trauma, which remember often comes before substance use as people try to self-medicate, might turn that intimacy into a weapon. We cannot repeat this historical mistake of prioritizing the chemical's promise over the patient's context.
We've covered a century of just chemical, and policy chaos. We've established that the political response to stimulants has been overwhelmingly hysterical, it's been rushed, and it has been racially targeted, starting with the immediate racialization of cocaine use back in the late 19th century.
We saw the policy shift from just ignoring the widespread opiate addiction of respectable white women to criminalizing the younger, less sympathetic user with the Harrison Act, all the way to the outright weaponization of cocaine against black communities through the decades-long crack disparity.
The sources just make it undeniably clear. The chronic focus on criminal suppression only leads to more of what Marie Nieswander called that artificial tragedy with real victims. When society tries to enforce its way out of a drug problem, the problem doesn't go away. It just shifts, and it increases human suffering, whether that's through spikes in HIV among intravenous drug users or the devastating chronic nature of MUD.
We also looked at the invisible costs of meth, which contaminates not just our brains, but our entire communities, endangering children and leaving this permanent ugly stigma on property and people.
And we noted how hard it is to even try and implement a basic public health solution, like methadone maintenance. Remember that anecdote from the sources? The community member arguing against opening a clinic who wasn't worried about the drugs, but asked that core question: why don't you pick up our garbage?
That moment just perfectly encapsulates the whole problem. That resident inherently understood the connection between addiction treatment and basic social services and community degradation. They were saying that you can't address drug use without also addressing poverty and political neglect and institutional abandonment. You cannot separate the drug from the environment where it thrives.
So we have to end with this provocation for you, our listeners. The ones who get that history always repeats itself if we're not paying attention to the patterns. We've shown that every historical attempt to suppress drugs like meth or heroin has consistently backfired. It always increases the cost, and it always increases the human suffering.
So, if the actual goal of drug control is public well-being, and given what we know about the chronic, expensive nature of MUD and the intergenerational trauma that fuels the demand for these drugs in the first place, does the success of any future policy rely less on enforcement and much, much more on fully committing to the long-term, expensive, and messy work of repairing the community degradation and trauma that created the demand to begin with?
It's time to decide. Do we keep paying for the artificial tragedy of prisons, or do we finally commit to paying for the long-term repair of our communities? That's something to think about until our next deep dive.